Well, I hope that this series has been helpful for you, or at least thought-provoking, and it should be challenging to you. I've failed to meet anyone that's really missed or been able to dodge the problems of overuse of our cell phones. Most people are struggling with it in one way or another, and specifically people with kids trying to manage use. And also, when you start to look at your kids, you start to look at self and go, how much time am I actually spending on my phone? And it may not just be with social media. It may just be just the kind of daily routine and how often we can pick this thing up, and how even those little 30-second moments can add up to several hours a day of just time on our phone. And if you've missed this series, we've said that in week 1 that our phones and social media specifically, as well as a phone and a screen-based childhood, is hindering children from good things, healthy things, and specifically hindering children from their relationship with God, which should, for the Christian, strike our hearts and make us desperate for change, because Jesus tells his disciples to not do anything to hinder the children. Literally, while he was here on earth, children were being brought, and the disciples said, no, keep them away. And there was a kind of a social reason for that. And Jesus broke the norm and said, no, like everyone needs to be able to come to me, and this is what my kingdom includes. And when we put a phone in our kids' hands, if we're not really careful and don't have boundaries and direction and vision and understand the dangers, then we are hindering children from developing healthy patterns and from moving towards a relationship with Jesus in no uncertain terms. And then we said that it's also not just causing a breakdown in relationship between us and Jesus and our kids and Jesus, but social deprivation. It is hurting our relationship with one another, which is critical for growth. It's hurting our relationship with our children when they're little and their ability to learn social cues and what they call attunement, learn how to interact, learn how to respond. And then it's hurting children's ability to engage in conflict and work through what life is like out there in the world, and keeping them from going and doing things that are outside and then actually involve physically risky play, which is more healthy than a cell phone. And some people think that a cell phone is better than the alternative or the possible things that could happen in our world, which is scary, but actually the data says otherwise. It's more healthy for your kid to get on their bike and just take off, and you don't maybe know where they are for a couple hours. That's right. It's a beautiful thing. On that topic, like I told a story of our oldest getting into a little bit of a scuffle with some friends, shooting a BB gun and shooting one of his friends in the back. That actually happened that week. And I'm not going to show you a picture, but my son this week also, we've really been doing this at home and really pushing our kids out into the world. And on top of just their, basketball and football and horseback riding and all the stuff that they do, we're just pushing them to their bikes and pushing them to their friends and pushing them to the neighborhoods and to go outside. And I'm not going to show you this picture, but my son caught a carp that, I'm not kidding you, was 30 pounds. It is the scariest, weirdest looking thing. But I was so proud of him. He caught this thing, and it took him several minutes to reel in, and then it was sitting right by his feet in the water, and it broke the line, and he actually jumped in the water to get it. And I was like, now this is holy and good. This is what God intended, for us to jump in the water and grab fish, which was exciting. Last week, we talked about anxiety. The name of the book that this has come from is The Anxious Generation. We talked about what anxiety is and how it is the perception of a future threat. And when it's gone overloaded and overstimulated, and we are concerned with more locations and more people than our brains are wired to manage, that it short circuits the system, and it makes us not capable of really living in the present because we're thinking about the future, and it's handicapped us and handcuffed us. And so we practiced presence through talking about how our senses, when we engage our senses, it's an impossible not to be present when you engage your senses. So if you think about your food, or you smell something, or you drink your coffee and focus on it, or you're comfortable, or you see something that's majestic, like maybe a mountain range, or any type of beautiful nature that just captivates you, you're in the moment. And to actually do that, to practice that, to put your phone away, to engage your senses, and move into a time of talking to God in prayer. And so today we're going to end this series, with one final push for not just the depravity and the problems of social media and screen, but a solution and one thing to put our minds on, a focus to move towards. I always love to lead people in a way of not just giving prohibition, don't do that, don't be here, but go here, a target. What's the goal? You know, the scripture is overwhelming with the wisdom of that for us to grow and be healthy, we cannot just put something off, we have to put something else on. We cannot just stop going in a direction, we have to start going in the right direction. And that's what repentance is, and that's what it means to be saved, is to have the Spirit of the living God transform the direction of our lives in such a way that we start to live the life that God designed us to live now, here through the power of the Holy Spirit and in the presence of the local church. And so the four main fallouts of too much social media, too much screen, that Jonathan Haidt outlines are social deprivation, which we hit on directly, attention fragmentation, which we didn't hit on directly, addiction, which we hit on partially, and then the other one it hits on is sleep deprivation. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but what the book outlines is that, you know, before the invention of the light bulb, the average night's sleep was 11 hours. And then when the light bulb was introduced, it moved to that 8 hours. And now that the cell phone is in your room and technology is there all the time, a lot of people suffer from lack of sleep. And some kids are only sleeping 4 hours a night or 3 hours a night. And as you know, young children, growing children, they need more sleep than you and I need, right? They need a good 8 to 10 hours, maybe more. And for them to have their phones in their room, which distract them and keep them awake, not just because they're engaging on it and it's stimulating their mind, but even just the effects of the blue light and all that kind of like overwhelms our senses and keeps us elevated, is destroying sleep. And this is something that if you read into this and you read the data, the domino effect of sleep deprivation is radical. You know, I mean, what happens to people when you're cranky and tired and you don't get enough sleep? I mean, we know how that goes if you miss an hour, right? When daylight saving comes, we're all just a mess. You know, just a mess from 1 hour. You're talking about people who are chronically losing hours and hours of sleep, deprived of what they need. Some of the greatest athletes in the world will tell you that the superpower for restoration and for performance in any type of athletic competition at the highest level is sleep. That if someone could bottle up sleep and make a pill of it, that it would be the number one selling drug in the world. That if you could just take sleep, then people would do that. If you could get what you could possibly get, because you cannot get it from a supplement. You cannot get it from what you eat. You cannot get it from anything else. It comes from the way God designed us to, basically for a little over a third of our lives, turn off and let the body go through a process of restoration and growth and strength. And when we lose that, we lose a lot. And so I'm not going to talk about this anymore. I'm going to tell you that this is the one that probably impacted our family the most, and this made us move phones. Again, we had done this a couple of years ago, and throughout the school year, no phones are allowed in the room at night. And we kind of let off the gas on that one at the beginning of the summer. And as I started preparing for this series, we went back to it. And several weeks, maybe a month before school started, no phones in the rooms at night. and it just dramatically changed everything about our kids. I mean, I'm not kidding you. Their affect, the way they engage when they wake up in the morning, the way that they talk to us, the way that they think about food, they wake up more hungry, they're more engaged when they come home from school. It is a radical change. So I know there was someone that said that there were some students who were teasing me that said, our dad takes everything you say literally and he's making us do all these rules. And I said, like, to you guys, like, chill, like, don't come in with just like a giant set of rules. Have conversations with your kids, talk about it, do it as a team, do it as a family, add some boundaries as you go, especially as you engage the material. But if there is one hard, fast rule you're going to make, it is no phones in the room at night. You need to make that change immediately. You need to do it. You need to teach your kids that they need to have a life outside of time on that phone. They need to go to their rooms and they need to read a book or draw something or build a Lego or whatever. Feed a dying turtle, whatever, okay? Like, they need to go and do that. That is absolutely necessary. If you're an adult and you cannot get off of your phone because you're lying in bed and you find yourself doom scrolling or whatever, you gotta move the phone away from your bed. You gotta do it, okay? Do it as a trial. Do it for a week. See how you do. You need more sleep. All right. That's not even what the message is about. 12 minutes. All right. Let's just get to this, okay? How much church is too much church? How much is too much? When is it like we had enough, right? When it's like, Joel, when you go 40 minutes? Oh, 10 minutes ago? Too much for you. Tom, you need way more church. How much is too much church, right? You heard the stories growing up, right? It was the idea that, every time the doors are open, there are families and that would just be in church, right? You're in church for at least an hour on Sunday morning. Then you go home, and I don't know what you do, change your socks or something. And then you come back and you're at church at night for the potluck and you're there for 2.5, 3 hours. Anybody relate to this at all? Anybody do this? Yeah, this is common. I didn't necessarily do this, but parts of this. And then, Wednesday night, you're at church for like 2.5 hours or something like that, right? So you ended up being in church for about 5 hours a week. Of course, in like colonial America, like you were in church all day, right? I envisioned like sitting on like a log cut in half, and you're just sitting there for like 7 hours, and the kids are wearing suits and ties, sweating through them. I don't know. It sounds awful, but for a whole day on Sunday, 7 hours. For some reason, I think church can sometimes become more about just going to church, right? Like it's a box you check, something that you're supposed to do. And I think that that's where a lot of times it can lose its potency. And then especially if, there's a lot of different terms. If church is boring, a lot of great leaders, the founder of Young Life and several other leaders said similar things to this. It's a sin to bore people with the gospel. There's nothing boring about Jesus. There's nothing boring about praising God. There's nothing boring about even dealing with heavy, dark things like the devil. I mean, come on. Like, we need to deal with what he's up to and his schemes, right? There's nothing boring about that. And some people bore people with church. And so we just go because we think we're supposed to go. And we think that just by going and checking the box, that something great happened. And what we need to know is that something great is happening, even if you don't like it. And that we probably do need to go more. And as we look at the research, there's no excuses. Maybe it became more about just going, and what it needs to be about is what happens just when we're here, why we're here. Why are we in this gathering? What happens to us from a physical, emotional, mental perspective? Maybe leaders would take the gathering more seriously if they knew what gathering does. If you knew, like, when you go, to church that something amazing happened to you when you were there, and not just that it changes you so that you have different results elsewhere when you leave, maybe you'd make it more of a priority. You know, I don't know about you, like I like to get a car wash, right? You just know when you go in the car wash, you're dirty or whatever, and then when you're done, you come out and you're like, man, I'm feeling good. You're like, feel good. Like you're fine to be seen driving down the street with your washed car because you went through something and it did something to you there. I think a lot of us feel like we just go through a car wash when we come to church, but we come out and it's like, well, I had to do that. Now, hopefully when I leave, my life will be better. What if when we came to church, God was up to something that was radically capable of changing us here, now, just because we're here, so that when we leave, our lives are actually different. Not that we check a box off and we hope that things get better because somehow they're supposed to get better because we earned some type of insight into the world by going here, or God's gonna give us favor. Maybe it's a transactional thing, right? God, I'll go to church, you fix my job. God, I'll go to church, you fix my marriage. Oh, it's not going well. God, why aren't you working? I go to church. See, the idea can be all about the results of church and not actually being here and what God is doing in the church while we gather, right? It doesn't just produce healthy results. Jesus is in the process of bringing his kingdom in its fullness on earth through his people who are the church. We are supposed to be those that shine light, reflect the goodness of God, embody God. We're the hands, we're the feet, we are the movement of God in the world. God is up to that through us. And when we come together, amazing things happen. It doesn't just produce healthy results, Christoformity. The gathering changes us. And it's not just the preacher that's saying this. It's not just the full-time committed ministers who pass the buckets to make sure we can keep on ministering, right? You got to come to church because we got to pass the bucket. It's not just, you got to come to church because I have an ego and I need to make sure people come to my church. You got to come to, no, this is not just the pastor, right? The pastor should want everyone together because intrinsically he knows that what the scriptures lead and what is intrinsic is that this is so powerful. And what we find is that the social sciences, it says that sacred gatherings are mentally, emotionally, relationally, and physically healthy. Just being here, you're doing something healthy. This is kale. Spiritual kale. I think kale has lost its day. It was like it's healthy, but it just wasn't good enough. It's way too crunchy. It didn't work. But you'd put it in your smoothie and you'd mix it up with something else because it's good. Something is happening to you right now that is healthy for you. And the reality is that as human beings, the social sciences kind of break us down and observe different parts of us. And we actually, as people, we perceive places to be sacred and or degraded. That's kind of, we naturally do that. Whether you know this or not, you do this. You think that's a sacred place associated with God, associated with divine, associated with elevated reality. And then this is profane. You can break it down to the more kind of common, you got the subway, it's profane, obviously. And you got St. Peter's Cathedral, oh, there it is, that's a sacred space. But it's more normal than that. A church is a holy place, a place that's been set apart, a place for God to do work, a place for God to meet people. Throughout the Old Testament, the temple, right, was the place where the glory of God lived. And the priests, the Levites, the people who were the representations of God would go there and represent people to God, and God were with people. And the only way that they could be there is if, people showed up the right way with sacrifices, but the presence of God was there. And then, of course, Moses had the presence of God on the top of a mountain. And he went and met with God, and it changed him just to be in the presence of God. It changed him. His face was so different that he had to cover his face because he was just changed by the presence of God. He had a message. He had tablets. He had stuff that God told him, but it wasn't just that God told him something. God changed him into someone else. Being in the presence of God is good for you. Being in the church is healthy for you. Does the phone-based life generally pull us upward into sacred space or downward? Jonathan Haidt says the phone-based life produces spiritual degradation, not just in adolescence, but in all of us. The phone-based life, it produces spiritual degradation. What that means is that it pulls us downward away from the holy good things of God. And that means that there's a cost for those of us who are not anxious or depressed. Even if you're not anxious and your phone's not ruining your life, if it's keeping you away from here, it's hurting you because it's pulling you away from what God can do for you when you come here. It's spiritual harm. It's hurting those that even have good mental health. And what research shows is that throughout human history, societies figured out that sacred gatherings and rituals that communities would come together with communal practices would pull people up into a realm of the sacred, and that this had a positive effect on their society, where the self kind of recedes and the collective kind of is formed. And what they find is that sacred gatherings that elevate people, they form strong communities. And so they found that sacred gatherings throughout human history and even today, what they do is they help us gain affection and trust for one another. In other words, going to the sacred place together holds us together when we aren't in the sacred place. And so if you come here, you get changed here so that when you're out there and you're with them out there or with us out there, we do better with each other and them or whoever out there because God does something in here. What they found is that the result of time together in a sacred space, it makes people happier, that it literally lowers the rates of suicide. One of the most alarming problems of the over phone-based life is people feeling like they can't live. You come here, and this just by being here makes you feel happier. It makes you less prone to do dark, horrific things to yourself and to others. But what they find is that people who are living in this kind of transient, disembodied reality, right, as a user, right, just an avatar, just a handle, interacting asynchronously, not in unison, not together. Everybody is on their own. As people who live only in networks rather than communities, these people who don't come into actual physical sacred gatherings are less likely to thrive. It's like the data's out. If that's all you do is you engage there in that place, then you are setting yourself up behind the 8 ball. You are behind. You are going to have a difficult time taking on the world. The phone-based life affects people spiritually by blocking and counteracting spiritual practices, things that happen when we get here. And research has found that there is abundant evidence that keeping up with what happens when we come here improves well-being. And so what happens is when we come into these healthy, sacred places and do these healthy, sacred practices, our lives improve dramatically. God just does something to us while we're here. And a couple of the things that have to happen, the way that these become unique, the way that they become practices that are healthy is first and foremost that they're shared, right? And that may be obvious, but it has to be shared. We have to do it together. You know, we have to come into this space with other people. We can't just be alone. There's a movement of people just spending more time alone. And you have to understand, it's important to be alone. It's important to spend time alone. It's important to get alone and get with God. And it's especially important in a social media, phone-driven world where there's so much stimulus that you're just overstimulated. You can't focus on anything, and attention is everywhere. And you need to quiet down your context and quiet down your mind. And that is critical, and we're missing that and probably need more of that than the alternative. But the overwhelming change that takes place in people's lives, predominantly throughout the scriptures, is in the context of people. It's with people. Like the scriptures are clear about that, like that you have to be with people. When Jesus was on earth, he didn't just like stay all by himself. He like gathered people to him. And then he went to people's houses, people who liked him and didn't like him. He went and spent time with ordinary people. He fell asleep in boats that they worked on. He was with people. And then he would go off and he'd be alone, but then he would go and be with people. Homo sapiens could just as well be called Homo duplex, or the two-level man. For what happens is we exist on two different levels. We spend most of our lives as individuals pursuing our own interests. And this is what they call kind of in the book, the realm of the profane, which means ordinary, day-to-day, worldly things where we're concerned about our own health. But what happens is when we share space together, what it does is it involves the reducing of self and selfishness, which then prepares a person to merge with or be open to something beyond themselves. Right? So when you come in here, intrinsically, you have to start considering others, which is how we make life work, which is what Jesus says is the hallmark of being a follower of Jesus, is to consider others. You want to be a good human, you have to be a human who considers others. And Jesus' Spirit is the only thing that can truly make us that type of person. So you can kind of get it to a degree, but the kind of love that God can do in us when we come together and just stand next to someone we don't know is remarkable. It takes us beyond self when communities engage in practices together and they share, when they move together physically in sync. What happens is when we move together in sync, when we clap together, when we sing together, when we stand up at the same time, sit down. I'm not making a commentary on liturgy or the Catholic Church or, a more high type of church. I'm just saying when we all move together, like when we leave our cars and walk in together, when we walk in through the door together, when we get our coffee with other people, when we sit down in rows with people who aren't in our family, and when we move and then we stand to sing and we say the words and we clap the hands, God is moving. God is doing something in you. You come together and what happens is you move, you increase cohesion and trust, and it means you reduce deviant social behavior. When you get around other people and you have to act in an orderly fashion, it has such a healthy impact on just the nature of you when you're alone, when you're in society. Like you will act differently because you came together in a sacred space that's lifting up God with other people who are lifting up God, and therefore it just starts to naturally shape your life and the way you interact with the people around you when you're not here. When communities do this, it reduces loneliness. It reduces loneliness. But what happens when all of the world is interacting through screens is there's no calendar that connects us. So we become individuals. We become isolated. We become avatars on our own, by ourselves. And there's a movement for individuality to stand out. But can I tell you that God moves in the collective, that God actually didn't make you to be an individual. This is not popular in terms of like the schema of the world. God didn't make you to be an individual. In fact, what the scriptures communicate is that individual is incomplete. Like if you're just with you, you're missing a whole lot. If you look in the scriptures, when God created man, the Lord looks at man and he says, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper for him. I will give him someone to do life with, and they will help one another. So God looked at all of his creation, and if you look at the story, they all had their own pairs. They all had partners. They all had, different pieces they interacted with, the different marriages that I talk about, the animals and the kids, and you see the trees and the ground and the water and the light and the dark, and all of it had itself, not just darkness, light, not just night, morning, not just the dirt, the water, like everything had something to interact with. God made man, and he looked at man alone, and he said, that's not right. It's not done. It's incomplete. You can't be alone. You need to go and be with people. What happens when we live as individuals, as these avatars alone, is it has a radically negative effect, especially on adolescents. It turns us into these radical political warriors. It draws adolescents into radical political, social movements where they kind of feel like they can be part of an ideology and yet never join a community. And it pulls them away from in-person communities. They can kind of let their voice be drowned in the collective tweet and never meet a person and stand next to a person and have what can only happen in person happen to them. The other thing is it has to be embodied. Like, it's not just shared, but we got to actually physically be here. And, I was doing this message the first week, and a good, lifetime church member texted me and said, I just watched all of that on my phone. And this is the challenge. This is the challenge. Watching on your phone is an alternative. Watching on your phone is, for your worst case scenario, if you can't be there, but if you think that you can get what you get when you come to the gathering, in the small group, in the large group, through your phone, you're wrong. It's great that you were connected to the information and that you're connected to the body while you're traveling or while you're away or while you can't make it, whatever. But if you think that is a equal replacement for the presence of you here in this place, you're wrong. It cannot do. We have to have this structured sacredness. And when we're all different individuals, we have our own calendar, so there's no meeting place. You see, when we all just meet together, we all have to agree when we're gonna meet together. Hundreds, thousands of people. That takes a lot of selflessness. That takes a lot of, focus. That takes a lot of moving your calendar around, because if they're all going to meet then I got to go there. But what happens when I go there is so important that I'll move everything to go there. If I live on my phone, then all I'm doing is just doing what I want to do when I want to do it, regardless of the rest of you. Oh, and that feels easy. And that feels streamlined. And that feels, quick and expedient. And it is ruining us. Having to make your calendar match everyone else's in the room matters. And when we come together and we move together, we actually clap together. They found that this ritual it's validated the enhanced feelings of communion, similarity, and trust. It means it makes a group of desperate individuals feel as though they have merged into one. When we sing, we're made to harmonize. You understand? Like, people are harmonious. The beauty of people, right? It's like a song, right? You have certain instruments playing a melody, then you have the bass line, then you have a backup line, you have a beat, you have all these different things that when they come together, it hits you at one time and you go, wow, that's the family of God. And then when we come together, we're supposed to put our voices together with other voices. Some that sing bad, some that sing well. You take the harmony, and we all sing together. And when we just sing together, God is moving. You're starting to learn that life is bigger than you. You're collaborating beyond yourself. The scriptures show us very clearly that God is a synchronous being, that he's in harmony with himself. Three persons in one with different roles, fulfilling all this massive reality that is God, but the individual nature of each person doing what they do together to move and change our lives. Even God is not alone. You can't be alone. Perhaps the most important embodied activity that binds people together is eating. I mean, look, we're supposed to be people who are wise about the schemes. I'm sorry, I can't help but say schemes. It's overly schemed, but it's schemes. But I like to say schemes. We're supposed to be people who are wise about the schemes of the devil. Can I tell you that like the phone and this kind of individualized life that hurts the corporate gathering? I have a hot take. It's ruining our families through ruining shared meals together. It's ruining our family time. It's stealing from what can happen when we break bread together. The research says people who break bread together have a bond. The simple act of eating together, especially from the same plate or serving dish, strengthens the bond and reduces the likelihood of conflict. Isn't it funny? You have conflict with them because of some BS on social media, so you won't have a meal with them, which is the one thing that could reduce the conflict. Isn't it funny? When you have a problem with someone, you just build an avatar of them in your mind. You have a fake, kind of conflict with them. You talk to yourself. But then when you get together with them, unless they're totally wild and weird, which happens, you kind of go, oh, once I got to know them, I like them. You know why? Because social media gives no context. Breaking bread together changes people. This is something that the virtual world will never be able to do. A healthier way to live would be to seek out more in-person communal events. That's what we have to do. It also is perspective shaping when we come together. The research shows that the teachings of Jesus. Now, Jonathan Haidt is an atheist, and he's arrived at these conclusions from a different perspective in terms of how they came about. But what he sees is that the teachings of Jesus, as it's related to how we are capable of loving one another, is the kind of perspective that we need to be healthy individuals. Jesus taught, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you will give will be the measure you get. Jesus is not telling us to avoid judging others entirely. He was warning us to judge thoughtfully and to be aware of using different standards for others than we use for ourselves. He urges us to fix ourselves or have God work on fixing us, to be critical of self, to look at self before we criticize everyone else. Social media trains us to do the exact opposite. Social media trains us not to look at self, but to look and be critical of others. It encourages us to make rapid public judgments with little concern for the humanity of those we criticize, no knowledge of the context in which they acted, and no awareness that we have often done the very thing for which we are publicly shaming them. Is that not true? Martin Luther King Jr. said this: we must develop and maintain the capacity, listen to this, the capacity we must develop and we must maintain. That happens here. That happens under the teaching of Jesus. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. We must develop the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. Jonathan Haidt summarizes it this way: from a spiritual perspective, social media is a disease of the mind. Spiritual practices and virtues such as forgiveness, grace, and love are a cure. If you don't develop forgiveness, which some atheists have argued is the greatest litmus test and proof that Christianity is real, because it can do something in your heart. It can actually, to love your enemy is a supernatural manifestation of God. You can't explain it without the workings of the Holy Spirit. And if you can, usually there's probably some selfish motive behind the door. They look like they've forgiven, but really there's something in it for them. Forgiveness is specifically from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus from God the Father. And if we don't develop that capacity, then we don't develop our ability to love. And when we live in the profane, we lose out on that perspective shaping reality. How many hours a week? How many hours a week do we come together? You know, we come together 1 hour. I mean, today, maybe a little longer. It's 10:09. I'm sorry, it's just funny. Like, I didn't want to go long, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go like over 40 minutes. I've gone 41 minutes. Like, listen, like, I'm going to do this right now. And some of you are not going to like it. Get over it. Like, freaking get over it. Like, I don't want to go long. I want to go 35 minutes because I said I would. I want to do that. But also, look at your screen time. How many hours were you on your phone today already? And an hour and 10 minutes is like, oh man. Now, part of it is because you're on your phone so much, you're addicted and you can't hold this attention. It's a vicious cycle. We have a serious problem here. How many hours a week should we be in here? How about 1.5 full, focused hours? How about really being here and knowing, God, do what only you can do while I'm here. God, here's my heart. Do it, God, do it. Some of us don't come to church because we say, I don't like it. So what? Go somewhere you like the first week. Go somewhere you agree with the theology, right? Go somewhere you like the first week and then never go again because you like it. Go because you need it. You know, go because you need it, not because, I got to get what I like. I got to get more of what I like. Retrain your mind to go, I'm going to go do what is good for me. Take your medicine, right? That's what you're supposed to do. Well, I don't like the way it tastes. Well, if you don't take it, you'll die. I guess I'll take it then. That's church. That's church. You need God's hands in your life. We need God. He's here. He's not there. He's not in this place that we think he is. Some of us will not come to church because they say, I'm not getting anything out of it. You're wrong. You're getting more out of it than you thought you would. It's changing you. And maybe if you've stopped it from changing you, the enemy can work. Right here, he can work in you and block you from the goodness that God is moving and doing. Some of us just have good reasons not to come to church. And I get that. There are times when, the schedule and everything makes it so we can't come to church. Having a good reason to not come to church doesn't change the value of church. It still needs to be a priority. If you don't go because you have a good reason not to go, doesn't mean that you still get what you get only if you go. So when you come to us and you're like, I can't make it. I did it. I don't know. We're not going to shame you. We're not going to tell you, we're mad at you. You know what the disposition I have is, I'm so sad for you. I'm sad for you. Not because you missed my sermon, but because you missed out on what the God of the universe has designed and built from the ground up for humans to engage and become more like him together. And at the same time, if you're just like anybody else, you're exposing yourself to a level of the profane world that is ripping your life apart. The scriptures are clear. Let us consider that we gather together, that we spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing or addicted to doing or tricked into not doing, but encouraging one another all the more as the day approaches. There's a synchronization that takes place in here. One day, every knee will bow, it says in Romans 14. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me and every tongue will give praise to God. Jesus sat with his disciples and he ate a meal with them. And he said, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. He said, come together, eat together, do it in remembrance of me. They took bread And when they had given thanks, he broke it and he gave it to them saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. The church needs to get together, to pray together, to sing together, and to eat together. Now, I put it in this really simple way to try to remember, right? You need to do this every week. Like GPS and then add an E, think Eastern Standard Time. I don't know. Just try to remember this, right? This is literally like silliness. Like, I don't care if it rhymes. I want you to remember that you need to get together. You need to pray together. You need to sing together. You need to eat together all the time, every week with the church. You have to come together. You have to pray together. You have to sing together. You have to eat together. It is in the together that God moves in our lives. It is in the together that the church is formed. Something is happening in your life when you clap your hands with the rest of the room. God is moving. Don't miss out. Let's stand together. We're going to sing a song. We're going to sing it together. We're going to sing it harmoniously. We're going to think of this moment more specifically than ever before. Don't think about that it's time to go. Don't think about that. Just think like nothing's more important than the next 4 minutes. It's just not. I mean, if your kid's late to the soccer game, I'm sorry, they're not going to go D1. One of them will in here, one. But no other ones will. They won't. They're fine. They're better to be here than to go. It's fine. My kids are in sports. I get it. It's not a judgment. It's good for kids to be in sports. All right? It's good for people to be in this room. Focus your hearts and minds on what God is doing in and through you for just 4 minutes. And know that just the practice of this is changing you into what God has for you and for this world.